Hey y'all, I'm trying to fit this into a 15-minute segment. If not, I'll have two segments and it'll be short. But this is to help you out with Chapter 8 and the homework due to all the 2-hour delays and, of course, me being sick. So I forgot where we left off, so I'm just going to start here as it is one of the questions on your homework. The Bantus were significant for many reasons. Mostly because they helped to spread their language all across sub-Saharan Africa. And as one of the biggest challenges for all of Africa, being unity, the ability to be able to verbalize or vocalize what you need and want from different groups of people all throughout sub-Saharan Africa was a great entity that was available because of the Bantus for a significant amount of time. So the Bantus helped spread their language, which eventually for the eastern trading cities would become Swahili, which is a mixture of Arabic and Bantu speaking words. So anyway, most African societies were considered stateless societies, which means they lack a centralized power. And again, if you want to break that down, it basically means there wasn't a centered government. There wasn't a, one person making all the decisions. It was centered around kinship, which meant it was the responsibility laid in the hands of different families, or it was mostly a society that worked together. And of course, if you didn't fulfill that responsibility, your tribe didn't survive, or you were banished because you didn't fulfill what you were supposed to fulfill, which also helped it helped to displace a lot of disputes. So what happens is any dissidents that were pronounced in communities, they would be banished immediately, because you could tell right away when somebody's not kind of going with the flow of the group. So these stateless societies would allow for the functions to happen in Africa, whereas in other places during this time, you might see, centralized government ruled by an emperor or a bureaucracy of some sort. In these stateless societies, that, wasn't the case. Now, alongside the linguistic opportunities that the Bantus laid out for sub-Saharan Africa, there were also the iron skills that they were able to spread, and their farming methods. So, and this allowed, for, of course, deforestation in certain areas, or even desertification, if you want to argue that way. But because of their knowledge of farming methods, it enabled, of course, the availability of more food. And a lot of the trading cities on the coast would rely on agriculture. And even in the West African areas, actually, while we're talking about that. And of course, before we move on, I just want to talk about one more thing about the whole Bantu linguistic thing. Because of their iron skills, of course, we can attribute it to their skill with farming, but the iron knowledge that they had also enabled them to take over other places, which, although you might not want to diffuse into what their language was, it happened anyway because it was forcefully, it was aggressive with the availability of their superior weapons, because most places at this time just used bow and arrow. But what I want to say is that once the Bantu foundation started mixing with Arabic and it created the Swahili culture and language, you're going to start to see that the culture of Africa also starts to change. And from the start, Africa was diverse in language and religion and geography. So I think we have to acknowledge the fact that Africa is a place of cultural amalgamation, and the effects of the Bantu migration as far as language goes is going to increase the the verbal communication that happens amongst tribes, but it's also going to allow for even like a tolerance to exist in some of the cities that interact with different cultures. Okay, so here we have some of those diverse faiths that are present in Africa. So animism, because of the strength of animism and its traditions in Africa, it was very resilient against Islam. And Islam became more of like an elitist faith, so a lot of the rulers of the kingdoms would create this like royal cult, as the textbook calls it, in practicing Islam. And the rulers were tolerant of people who still wanted to practice animism, of course, because they didn't want to lose their relationship with the people. Animism is eventually going to lead to, this shaman type feel of a group. So you have these divine priests who would rid the evils and protect the community with mysticism and ancestor worship, which is another piece. There was ancestor worship, very relevant here. Again, and you could relate this to the Chinese ancestor worship. You could relate it to Shintoism and even Taoism. So let's move on from here. We did a couple things in class about the trans-Saharan West African trading kingdoms, Ghana, Mali, Songhai, and over time their borders extended, but what they're all known for is trade. And that's what you have to focus on, that whether or not Islam was prominent in different ways in these different kingdoms or the different leaders they all had something in common, that they worked towards a gold for salt trade. And the trans-Saharan trade routes, and of course the domestication of camels, enabled this to occur and for the cities to develop. So here we have the Berbers, and again, these are, I think we did this in class, but just in case, again, we're seeing another example of this mixing of different groups of people. So again, there's that word amalgamation again, and we're looking at this group in and across the Sahara Desert. They're the Berbers, and the reason why they were able to travel and trade and traverse the Sahara Desert is because the camel became domesticated, and they were able to travel in caravans all across this route. So without the domestication of the camel, this would not be. So for your homework, when it talks about analyzing how the Arabs and the Berbers adapt to travel and trade across the Sahara, you definitely have to mention the camel. You have to mention what about the camel enables trade across the Sahara Desert. What are some other animals that were domesticated at this time that would not survive the desert? So those are some things you want to talk about. You also can talk about the oasis across the desert where those were available, and just different things that would enable these groups of people to trek this massive, massive desert, and how they were able to actually move with all of these salt blocks. And the camel was able to hold a lot of weight, and you needed that for salt. And as far as the salt blocks go, they were more valuable if they were obviously in these bigger pieces rather than chunked up. So let's go to our first West African trading kingdom. This is the smallest of the three. Okay, and these people of Ghana were eventually taken down by a group called the Almoravids, and they saw the value in the gold that Ghana had, and they would attack and invade. And because of their want and need for this gold, this selfishness for them, they would disrupt trade for a brief period, and Ghana would split. But that's okay, because here we have Mali. And one of the most famous rulers in Mali became known as the Lion Prince. If you ever saw The Lion King, actually by Disney, it takes the story of Sundiata and, of course, exaggerates it and changes it a little bit for a Disney movie, so it works. But Sundiata's story of how he rose to power was told by griots for years. I mean, they would start out the story in a very dramatic way, you know, an ancestor to the throne, the great king of armies, this Mansa, this king who was suffering in childhood, rises out of the ashes to become this wonderful lion. And they were very dramatic about how he was able to succeed in power even though he was dealt a bad hand as a child. So, again, this strong tradition of telling stories verbally actually would progress over time to mean that if you memorize these stories and these histories, it would show a sign of you were more valuable. Whereas if you were reading from a book or if you were a writer, many of the West Africans kind of looked down upon it because they thought it was going to bring about this terrible change where people start to or they stop forgetting, you know, their stories, and is like a little bit of a weak-mindedness. But we all know that eventually books, for Timbuktu especially, are going to be pretty much just as valuable as gold. So, you know, learning was valued throughout the West African kingdoms. Sundiata's story, just really quickly, because I don't have a lot of time left on this piece, is that he was crippled as a child, and he had many brothers, and they kind of cast him out because of his weakness, and he was banished, for lack of better words. And then he eventually grew stronger, and his handicap was weakened over time, and he became this strong man. And he'd eventually come back, and he would help to establish Mali, which would eventually become this great kingdom with this beautiful city of Timbuktu that many people travel to on purpose because of how well trade was protected because of what Sundiata set up. So the question on your homework that asks you about as far as the how did the trans-Saharan trade route promote the growth of Timbuktu, I think you have to also mention the fact that because of the safety that was encouraged and promoted, merchants were more willing to travel on it. And of course, especially Mali, the West African trading kingdoms were very strict in law and in justice. So if you were guilty, they were not having it. So people knew that if a crime was committed, it would definitely be dealt with. So people were more willing to travel across trans-Saharan trade route because they knew there would be safety, protection, and justice. And of course there was incentive. When you got to Timbuktu, it not only was a center of trade that was great to get all different goods from, you know, different parts of Africa, but it also was a center of learning and worship. There were beautiful mosques that had different aspects of architecture. There was a library. There was huge markets, and the culture was different. And I'm going to talk about that in the next slide as far as women goes, which will probably help you with questions 7 and 8. So I'm going to stop here and start off another segment in a little bit.